You're listening to the B&H Photography Podcast. For over 40 years, B&H has been the professional source for photography, video, audio, and more. For your favorite gear, news, and reviews, visit us at bnh.com or download the B&H app to your iPhone or Android device. Now here's your host, Alan Weitz.
Greetings and welcome to the B&H Photography Podcast. This week, the 2018 edition of the U.S. Open is in full swing out in Forest Hills, and we're going to be taking full advantage of the occasion by doing a tennis-centric show. I don't know if that's a real word, but I like it, tennis-centric, right? It's good. Flows. In the first half of our show, we're going to speak with B&H Photography Podcast veteran Chris Nicholson. In the past, we've spoken to Chris about night photography, as he is an instructor and the director of content at National Parks at Night. But like many of us, Chris wears several hats, and he's also a longtime tennis photographer who'll be working the U.S. Open. We're going to speak with Chris about the challenges, the techniques he uses, and maybe even a few tips for beginners. I know we're going to get a few. In the second half of today's show, we're going to hop into a waiting police escort for an unimpeded trek to Forest Hills, and we're going to be meeting and talking with Drawbridge Digital, a technology company managing a team of 20 photographers and editors as they handle the imagery for the usopen.org site and manage all of the content being uploaded to their archive. But first, welcome back, Chris. Nice to have you back here.
Thanks for having me.
So, you're back here. So, amongst other things, you shoot stars and heavenly stars and tennis stars.
Right.
You are going to be shooting there as well as teaching a workshop. Is that correct?
Yes. Yeah, I'll be shooting the full 2 weeks, and I teach a workshop during the Challenger tournament, which happens right before that.
What is the Challenger tournament?
The Challenger tournament is it's a smaller tournament, but it's a big tournament. It's still one of the biggest in the world, where lower ranked players can play for a spot in the main tournament.
That's what I thought.
So it's still. They're among the best 200 players in the world, pros, really, really great matches. And it's one of the best kept secrets in New York sports because it's free to attend.
Mm-hmm. It's not a big secret anymore.
No, it's
how many downloads did we have last month?
It's a great event. I mean, you walk in for free and you could just watch world-class tennis all day.
That's great.
And so that's what I'll be teaching the workshop during.
That's pretty unique, isn't it? Because I get the impression, I don't do sports events anymore. I haven't done it for a long time, but it seems to me that access is just getting tighter and tighter.
Yeah, it would be like being able to walk into a AAA baseball game and shoot for free, except the players are better than that. These are Major League Tennis players that just didn't qualify for the main tournament.
What are some of the things you can be going over in your workshop? Because that sounds pretty interesting.
Yeah, people who come are either tennis fans, who like to shoot, or photographers who just want to take a crack at shooting a professional sport. And tennis isn't easy to shoot, so I try to teach enough so that people can go away with better photos at the end of the day than they started with. And a big part of that is just knowing where to shoot at which times a day. Mm-hmm. One of the big challenges in tennis photography is the light and busy backgrounds, and so just knowing that the light at court 10 is going to be better at 6 o'clock than it is at 1 o'clock. Knowing what's the best court to shoot at this time of day in terms of the shadows, getting backgrounds in shadow, and when the nice golden light, what court that hits later in the day, and things like that. So, I teach skills and I teach strategy for getting the photos, but really the biggest part, I think, is getting people at the right court at the right time of day to do the best work they can.
I was thinking a lot about this prepping for the show because my real sporting experience was motorboating and powerboat racing and things of that sort. And I had a lot more freedom than you do, I guess, was shooting that because I was able to change direction. I was able to follow them around in a chase boat or in a helicopter, just literally go all the way around. I had a lot of options for capturing that boat or boats to make them look good. You don't have those kind of options when you're shooting tennis matches.
So you're right. You can't move around whenever you want. You can't move around in the middle of a point, obviously. Tennis is, it's kind of like golf in terms of the focus of the players, and there's no moving, there's no talking when they're playing. So you have to wait for a changeover to move if you want to change positions. But you can change positions. You've got an entire side of the court to work with, and if you just think in terms of using you just like shooting anything else, you change your angle by 10 degrees and put a different lens on, and now you can make completely different kinds of photos. So you can get into ruts of shooting the same type of photo over and over again, and there's only so many forehands and backhands. You can shoot them. I'll tell you, 99 out of 100 photos that any tennis photographer shoots look exactly the same as the ones they did yesterday. You're looking for that 100th shot, right? And a lot of that is just having the experience of knowing when to change position and when to change the lens and to just try to find something interesting to shoot.
How many physical positions do you have at say, the U.S. Open? How many places do you have to choose from as a photographer?
Well, it depends on where you are. In the main stadium, you can only shoot from one side of the court. There's a photography pit with 2 rows, and it runs the entire length of the court from corner to corner. So you've got a lot of space in there until you get to the final. It can get a little crowded and a little Lord of the Flies in there sometimes at the end.
Just to jump into there, what's the pecking order? I mean, does it work out like the size of the media organization? And of course, the people that are affiliated with the Open and the
Yeah, well, there's some obvious ones, like of course Sports Illustrated is going to get whatever spot they want, and Getty Images will get the spots that they want. The New York Times, the U.S.T.A. communications department is very smart about where they're going to get the most press and strategize that accordingly. That said, there really isn't any photographer who should complain because there's so many great spots to shoot, and the U.S.T.A. in my experience has always gone out of their way to make sure that any media working the tournament gets what they need to produce the stories photographically or otherwise that they need to get. An interesting thing is when you get to the semifinals and the final, there is a lot of media. I don't remember what the number is, but there's far more photographers that cover this event than can fit in the photo pit on Arthur Ashe Stadium during a big match. So one of the things they do, I always found this interesting, is depending on who's in the final and what country they're from. So if you get, for instance, a Japanese player in the final, then more of those reserved seats are going to go to Japanese photographers, right? Because obviously there's a high interest in that country for
the home team,
from who wins, right? So that's an interesting thing that changes year to year. So you always have those staples like the Sports Illustrated photographers, et cetera. But the mix in there will change depending on who's playing that
And
match.
have you ever been frozen out? Like, you ever been out of that main pit area and you have to go just wander and find a spot? Or
I haven't. Oh, geez, knock on wood.
Knock on wood. Okay.
But I'm fortunate in that I've had 2 major clients credentialing me. At first, Tennis Magazine for the first half of my career, and now my major client is the U.S. Tennis Association. Okay. So most of the photo work I do for them is what runs in the daily program.
Yeah, you got an uncle in the biz.
Yeah.
Talk a little bit about like the early rounds and what we were talking about earlier, how you can have access at the side courts and you can probably at that point really move around in a way that you couldn't otherwise, right?
Yeah, it's not just that main stadium. There's 17 courts at the Open, and I always say the best ticket in tennis, people ask me, when should I go to the Open? It's those first 4 days, because you've got 17 courts of matches happening from 11 in the morning until it could go until 2 in the morning. It's just constant. There's just always world-class action happening everywhere on the grounds. And that's exciting for a fan, and it's exciting for a photographer too. If you just want to bring your camera and shoot all day, that's the time to do it.
Absolutely. That sounds pretty cool. It's like that at not just the U.S. Open, but all Opens. I mean, maybe the field isn't as big as it is in the U.S. Open, but there's always going to be early round action that's more accessible, correct?
Yeah. And the 4 Grand Slam events are all the same size.
Okay.
128 players per draw.
Right.
So there's a lot of action going on in those first few days.
Do you ever depend on or make use of remote cameras just so you can get more than one frame at a time?
I don't. I know photographers who do. Getty in particular sets up a whole slew of remotes, but you need a proven need for those photos.
What's the issue with sound? I mean, do you have tennis players talking to photographers at certain points and saying, I mean, maybe less so now, cameras are more quiet, but have you ever come across that idea?
I did once, but not at the U.S. Open. Technically speaking, there is a code of conduct for the photographers, and one of the things is you don't make noise. I mean, we're very privileged to be able to sit right at the side of the court. Right. We're in prime position to disturb players. And so part of that code of conduct is you don't shoot during the serve, per se, to make that click. I did that once by accident at a smaller tournament, and I will always remember the look. Pete Sampras was in the middle of a serve. Oh, wow. And sometimes you just, you're focusing, right? And you've got the shutter button halfway down, and sometimes you just push a little too hard and you shoot it by accident. And that's what happened. He had tossed the ball, and the camera went, and he caught the ball and just looked right at me. I mean, he knew exactly where that click came from, and he just glared at me, and I, you know, what am I can't run out and apologize, right? But it was completely an accident.
Just point to the guy next to you. Go, keep going like this.
But at the U.S. Open, it's not a big deal because first, it's a bigger space.
Right.
There's more noise. You know, it's we got a New York crowd. You know, we don't care if you want it to be quiet, right?
That's just a suggestion.
It's
merely
a suggestion.
Which is what makes the U.S. Open so special, too.
Yeah,
right?
but players will talk about that, about the U.S. Open having special challenges to play because the New York crowd is different. It's a very excitable sports crowd. I mean, you've got very knowledgeable fans who get into it. Well, I mean, one of the things everybody loves about the New York fan is you don't have to know the players of the team. You just want to see a good game, right? You know what the players will talk about that's different at the U.S. Open. So I think part of their mentality is shutting out distractions. And I've never at the U.S. Open seen a player complain about a photographer in terms of noise.
Does anybody make use of silent shutter? Because a lot of cameras offer that right now, and that eliminates that whole issue. Now you can shoot perfectly silently anytime you want.
You mean like in a quiet mode?
Yeah,
where it's a little quieter.
Well, there were like Sony A7, a mirrorless camera.
Mirrorless. I'm sure somebody has shot mirrorless, but I don't.
Okay.
I'd say 99% of the photographers are shooting DSLRs.
Still?
Yeah. Because you get a faster frame rate. But the big thing is the mirrorless cameras use a different autofocus. So the phase detection autofocus is better for tracking that fast motion as of now. So the mirrorless uses contrast-based, right?
Oh, I know that, mirrorless used to be terrible, but it's caught up a lot, but it's still not at ringside or courtside.
I would say, even with the high-end DSLRs, there's ones that tennis photographers in particular won't use because the ratio of frames in focus to not in focus isn't good enough. I shoot primarily with the D5 and very rarely have a photo that's out of focus unless it was my fault.
And do you use continuous burst mode a lot when you're shooting? Or?
I always have it on.
Right.
I don't always use it.
Right.
I want it on for the option to be able to shoot a sequence, but I'm usually shooting single frames. And I've tried both strategies because and there's nothing wrong with either strategy. Some photographers, some sports photographers will just lay on the shutter. Something happens and they'll lay on the shutter and get 20 photos to pick from. And that's fine. You're guaranteeing yourself something, right? I tried that at one point in my career. In fact, I spent an entire U.S. Open with that strategy just to see what happens. Is this good for me? And what I found is, for me, I ended up at the end of the tournament with the same exact number of good photos, but a lot more to edit.
A lot of editing.
Right.
Oh, yeah.
So I figured if I'm going to get the same yield anyway, let me just use the method I always have of picking my moments to shoot, which also for me has more creative satisfaction.
Sure.
Because instead of lucking into the good shot, I decided when to shoot it, and I created it.
Right.
So that's why I go fishing with a shotgun.
So you really, I guess it depends on the tournament and the time and the place and the noise, but you are reluctant to shoot during a serve? Is that
not at the U.S. Open? It's funny because I still feel a little weird about it because I
traumatized.
I used to shoot more. I don't really shoot small tournaments anymore, but I used to early in my career. I worked at Tennis Magazine for 10 years, and I shot more smaller tournaments there. So it's always something that's still in the back of my head. But I know at the U.S. Open it's okay.
Yeah.
The only time that you might not want to do it is if you are shooting bursts. And you had asked about the quiet mode. If you're shooting for a magazine like Tennis and you're shooting an instruction article, you might need a sequence.
That's right.
And shooting like that in a serve, I could see. Again, I haven't seen a player complain about it, but I absolutely would understand if that being more distracting than just a few random clicks. There's a Japanese photographer. I've seen him shooting at the U.S. Open for 20 years, and I've never actually met the guy. But he uses a blimp on his camera because he shoots for one of the Japanese tennis magazines, and as far as I can tell, all he does for the tournament is shoot sequences. And he'll move around to different spots in the stadium in the pit with his camera in this big leather blimp. Shooting bursts, and you could be sitting next to him.
It's a leather blimp, or is it one of those Jacobsons?
It's like leather covered. I don't know. I don't know the brand.
Yeah. Something I was curious about: focal lengths. I imagine you don't really need that wide a range if you're shooting in a stadium? Am I really wrong about that?
Well, I mean, the range you use depends on how creative you want to be.
Right.
I find a 400 millimeter 2.8 is dead on for tennis at the U.S. Open. At a smaller tournament, you might be a little closer, and a 400 might be too much.
Now, how are you filling your frame with that's actually longer than I thought you'd really need. So it's 400 millimeter from where you usually shoot from. How much of your subject are you seeing? I mean, is it a head and shoulder? Is it waist up? What do you see at 400 millimeter?
Well, it depends on where you're shooting.
Yeah.
So if I'm shooting from the other end of the court, then that could be almost full body in the frame with some space. There's one thing I'm thinking about with tennis is if I have the full body in the frame, you also have to think about what happens on the backswing, or if the racket goes high over their head, or if they're hitting it. You need to leave extra space for other things to happen, right? But if the player's on the same side of the court as me, then that would be about a half body shot, which gets very difficult because tennis is a fast sport. I mean, you're shooting your shutter speeds to freeze them. I mean, you're talking a minimum of 1200th of a second to freeze the action, and really 1600. 2000 if you really want crisp action, which you don't always. Sometimes you like a little blur. But the point is, it's a fast sport. So if you're framing somebody half body and trying to get that ball in that tiny, tiny fraction of a second that it's going to be in the frame, it's difficult. But those photos are very dynamic. And it's funny you mentioned that it's a longer focal length than you would expect, because I didn't expect that focal length early in my career. Again, I started at Tennis Magazine. I was very fortunate. My first job there was working in the library, and a big part of my job was organizing the photos in the library. So I would get to study them just day in and day out. And I knew the photographers I liked. And when I finally, when I got to shoot and became friends with some of them, one of the things I would do is just sit next to them in the pit and try to figure out why are they doing what they're doing. I remember watching Karen Levy, who she's not really shooting tennis anymore, but she was one of the best, absolutely one of the best. And I would see her shooting courtside, shooting with a 300 or 400 millimeter lens, like right at a player who was 30 feet away. And I was, what the heck is she doing? I can't imagine. So I would go out there and try the same thing, and just see what I could make of it. That's what she's looking for. And so, yes, and a 300 or 400 millimeter most of the time. But like I said, you can be more creative than that. There's another longtime tennis photographer, Mel Digiacomo, who lives in the New York area. Sure. And I hardly ever see a telephoto on his camera. He's all wide angle. He shoots in a very classic, almost photojournalistic, artistic style. It's just beautiful black and white work. And his photos look completely different than anybody else because, he might put a 15 millimeter on and shoot a whole match like that. And, how are you shooting somebody who's that far away from you with a wide angle lens? And he's a master at it. When you see a Mel tennis photo, you know it's a Mel tennis photo.
Yeah.
Let me ask a little bit about shadow and light, because obviously in some cases in any outdoor court, you're going to have often that really sharp distinction between, half of the court that's in shadow and half the court's in light. How do you work that? How do you find the angles that are better for you? And
I approach tennis photography in the same way that I approach landscape photography, which was a conscious decision that I made maybe about 5 or 6 years into shooting sports, where I just started kind of thinking of it in the same terms. I said, everybody kind of shoots sports the same way. What can I bring different to it? And I said, well, there's this whole other genre that I love to shoot. What can I bring from that? And it plays into exactly what you're asking about in terms of looking at the light and paying attention to the backgrounds and trying to create pretty photos that happen to be a sports photo, right? Part of that challenge is most of the tennis matches are happening during light that we would normally not shoot in, right? 1 o'clock in the afternoon on a sunny day in a place with a busy environment with a lot of people wearing white and hats that are casting shadows.
It's called dynamic range hell.
Yeah, that's a good, that's a good, white towels on the ground in the corner of the court. There's just so many background distractions to worry about. So one of the things I'll look for at that time of day is to shoot backlit, right? Because that helps, you got to open up, which reduces the contrast a little bit. Another thing is if I see a backcourt, that back wall of the court in shadow, that's my background. Use a nice long lens to isolate the player against that shadowed background and get them side lit. And now even at 2 in the afternoon, I can create a photo that The final version looks like very dynamic lighting, and they really pop. That subject pops.
Something I'm curious about. I'm not a tennis buff. I've seen it. I know it. I recognize a tennis game when I see one. Tennis match, a tennis stadiums, at least the professional stadiums, are they designed and laid out in a way that the sun would be side light on the main courts, or are you in situations where in the morning some person is totally backlit, in the afternoon the other person is totally backlit?
Well, depending on what time of day you're shooting, you might have a shadow moving across the court and all that, which can be a challenge, but can also be an artistic opportunity. And that's how I would say, look at it. That's one of the things I would talk about in the workshop. Is let's use that shadow.
Right.
Pay attention to where the player is going to be. And in fact, a lot of times you get a lot of shadows on the court. If you get mixed shadows on the court, that means you also have mixed light on the court, which can be very dynamic. And you might spend 10 minutes not shooting, waiting for the player to run into the right spot. But that 10 minutes is well spent when that player does run into the right spot, into that tiny bit of light in a court full of shadow. Yeah. And what a great artistic image you can make.
Some of the greatest shots were when you see that long shadow, like, the arm's up, ready for a stroke, and that long shadows following them. Yeah, that's cool. What about night games and the lighting, stadium lighting? Any challenges? Anything? Is it easier?
It's easier now.
Yeah.
It used to be, before digital, nobody would shoot the night matches unless it was a huge match. You might have an Agassi-Sampras match, and you say, well, of course we're going to shoot that. We don't care what the light is, But even then, you've got to shoot fast shutter speeds. You'd have to get, the standard was you would shoot Fuji Press 800 and push it 2 stops, and it looked not good,
Looked like, but 800 speed film pushed 2 stops back in the day. Yes.
And, but that's the best you could do. Now, the cameras are so good and the lights are better. So that combination, I'm still kind of pushing the limit of the camera, but I can go out there and shoot at ISO 1600, with a good camera like the D5 and get crisp images that look good on a glossy color page in the program, and still get a decent shutter speed. The lights are better.
What kind of lights are they? Because are you dealing with color cast still? Are they switching to LEDs at all? Or anything that's friendlier to imaging?
I haven't heard anything about the lighting changing. I will say the tricky thing with the light at Arthur Ashe Stadium is that for some reason you can't see it to the naked eye, but the corners are darker. So as a photographer, you see it, because all of a sudden this photo looks a half a stop dark. But as a fan, I would be surprised if any fan noticed it.
A question about I guess the editorial side of it, when you want to go and get a photo published, do they look for, let's say, Serena makes a great, a winning shot, but you have a great shot of her from earlier in the match. Do they care that you didn't get the winning shot? Because I know in other sports you may have a great shot of somebody doing something from earlier in the game, but if it's not the the newsworthy moment of it, that photo's not going to get published. Does that play at all in tennis the same way?
It depends on the client. It depends on the media outlet and what they're looking for. Like Sports Illustrated might be very interested in that winning shot.
Yeah.
The people I shoot for, so I said I shoot a lot for the U.S.T.A. and for the U.S. Open program, and there's a book company I do a lot of work for, and World Tennis Magazine, some websites. They're more interested in having a pretty photo. Yeah. They want a photo where the player looks good, especially the U.S. Open, because this is the premier event, and this is the showcase of everything they do. So they want the player to look good. And one of the interesting parts of that is they have to look fundamentally sound. So, you shoot a player like Venus Williams, who's incredibly athletic and makes some shots that you can't believe, that she makes. But in those moments that to you as a fan are very interesting to watch unfold, they're not fundamentally sound.
Right.
So those photos don't always sell to the clients that I work with.
Right. Well, what if you have, let's say, speaking of clients, you have a Casio watch ad in the background or whatever other ads. Mm-hmm. Do you have to consider either getting them out of the frame or including them in the frame, or is that not really an issue?
Well, the sponsors would like those ads to be in the frame.
Of course.
Yeah. I mean, that's why they pay to put them there.
Right.
As a photographer who's trying to do a good photo, and we know that doing a good photo a lot is paying attention to your backgrounds, right? You generally try to keep those out, which is challenging. There are times where I would throw away or not even shoot what would be a fantastic action photo because there's just too much logo stuff going on in the background.
Do you have to keep vertical and horizontal in mind, because you're shooting obviously for a number of end uses?
Right. All consciously flip. Again, I'm trying to make a nice photo. I had an interesting change in my career about 10 years ago. I thought I was going to stop shooting tennis. And business, just every year it had gotten a little less and a little less. And I got to a point where I said, I don't think I'm going to really be able to make something useful out of this anymore. And that was going to be my last year shooting tennis. And my last tournament was going to be the U.S. Open that year. And I got to the tournament and I decided I'm not going to spend my last U.S. Open trying to shoot what I think my clients want. I'm just going to go chase pretty light. I don't care who the player is. I don't care if it's, somebody that nobody's ever heard of. If that player's in prettier light than Serena is, I'm going to shoot the player in the prettier light. And I spent most of those 2 weeks doing that and sold more photos than I had ever in my career. And that changed things for me. And I stayed shooting tennis. So to answer your question, yes, I do pay attention to vertical, horizontal. I mean, one of the things that the program wants is posters, which have to be vertical, and the cover has to be vertical. So I have to get vertical photos if I want to be producing what the client wants. But I also want to shoot what I want to shoot. And I want to do artistic photos that changed my career. I'm not going to go away from that. It saved my career making that decision. So I'm going to still pursue pretty photos and interesting ideas and try to come up with new photos to shoot, new ways to approach creating an image of tennis. And if that means flipping the camera horizontal, right? I mean, we always want to change our approach and break the mold of what we did yesterday to try to find something new that we can create.
A quick question about, do you use a monopod?
I do use a monopod. Yeah.
And most photographers do?
Yeah,
that big lens?
it's if you haven't done sports photography, it almost sounds counterintuitive. Like, I just told you 10 minutes ago that I'm shooting at 2,000th of a second.
Yeah.
So why do you need a monopod at 2,000th of a second? Part of it is anything. I'm a big believer in incremental improvements to your photo. Anything you could do to make the photo just a tiny bit better, even if it's not perceptible. You do 10 of those things, and now it's a perceptible difference. So even that tiny bit of sharpness, that extra sharpness I can get by using a monopod, I want that. The other part is a 400 millimeter lens is not something that you put in your pocket and carry around with you all day, right? It's heavy. It's not too heavy to lift right now and use for a few minutes, but
let's try walking around for a few hours.
90-degree day at the U.S. Open, walking on pavement, and you're shooting for 14 hours. You don't want to be hand-holding that camera for all that time. So just using the monopod is a way to just give yourself a rest from the weight and save your muscles and save your sanity to pay attention to the photos.
And do you normally take a break and offload all your photos to your laptop, to a drive, and then get back at it? Or what's your workflow in that sense?
Only if somebody needs a photo right now.
Okay.
Usually I just want to shoot. I don't even like taking a break for lunch. There's days where it's 4:30 and I'm just like, I have to eat something or I'm not going to get through the rest of the day. But again, there's just stuff going on and I want to be I love shooting. I enjoy it. It's not just the business end, but there's both components there, and I want to be out shooting. So I don't want to have to take a break to go and dump photos. So I save that usually for when I'm done shooting.
Do you do much chimping in the midst of the action?
Do a lot of chimping.
Okay.
Yeah. Chimping has a bad reputation, but if you do it responsibly, it improves your photos. And again, so we talked about how timing in tennis can be really hard. Really a tiny fraction of a second is the difference between a photo that gets published and a photo that ends up in the trash. Just a fraction of a second. So imagine you're tired, or you couldn't have coffee that morning, or you got into a fight with your spouse, or your kid got a bad report card. Anything that's on your mind could change your timing enough to have bad photos. When I was shooting film, I would remember days where I felt good and I'd get the film back the next morning and find out that my timing was off all day. And I didn't know, because that's how small that incremental difference is.
Yeah.
With digital, I can do that photo and say, well, my timing's off today, I have to adjust. And now I've just saved a whole day of work.
Right.
And a reputation.
I'm just thinking about, imagine your timing is perfect, and then, what the tennis player makes one of those faces, which I'm sure they make all the time, with one eye is closed, their mouth is like this, their face is like that, and then the photo is maybe useless to you because, I mean, it's a great shot in every aspect except for they have this horrible face.
Yeah.
I mean,
and you might have an idea for a photo too, right? Like I can remember times where I'm always looking for a new way to shoot a tennis photo, right? And I might have an idea, but the timing's got to be so perfect, and I want to get it. It might take me 20 tries to get it. As much as I talk about how tennis is difficult to shoot, one of the things that makes it a lot easier is that a tennis player is going to do the same thing 100 times in a match. Right. So if you have an idea for a shot you want and you blow it and you can't figure it out, you have 100 more times to work on it and get it right. So there's definitely times where I've had an idea and I couldn't get the timing right or couldn't get the angle right, and I would chimp, and that's how I knew I didn't have the shot, and I knew how to adjust, and I'd work on it and get it. That's
good advice. What about just shooting around the courts? I mean, do you find a lot of images of towels and a tennis bag and all those kind of like side shots that don't have to do with the action? Do you shoot much of that, or is that just a waste of time?
Ambiance Photos is what that's what we used to call them at Tennis Magazine, and it was a big deal. We were always looking for those. If a magazine is doing an article about an event, it's not all about the players, right? There's an experience to be had there. There's a lifestyle, and they need photos to illustrate that. The U.S. Open program uses those, because that's part of what they're selling is the experience of being there. So there's absolutely a call for those photos. If there's not a match going on, but the light's pretty, absolutely, I'll walk the ground and I'll look for things. It gets challenging, especially, I've shot the U.S. This will be my 22nd or 23rd U.S. Open that I've shot. And the ground's changed, but not so much that every year I'm saying, oh, look at all these new photos to do, right? It gets hard after a while to find.
And that's one thing I found when I was shooting, especially if I was doing the same subject matter for a long stretch of time. What are some of the things you've done to sort of freshen up your eyes?
So there's actually been a couple of years where I said, I'm not shooting any ambiance this year just to get away from it and then come back, with fresher eyes another time. There's been times I've tried try something that photographers don't do or that sports photographers don't do. I remember one year I had made it a point. I said, I'm going to find some rules to break.
The old bad boy comes out.
Find a rule to break. And I remember I'm in the middle of this tournament, and I was up in the upper reaches of the stadium shooting down on the court. And I got up there and I said, okay, I've got to go to the left so that I'm not shooting backlit. And I said, wait. My whole point this year was to find rules to break. I'm going to go to the other side of the court and shoot backlit. Now, when I say backlit, this is the sun bouncing off the court and right into the camera lens, which is just, why? Why would you put yourself through trying to figure out that exposure and deal with that? And so I'm up there with a big lens, and I had a drop-in polarizer filter. And so I said, let me put in the polarizer. And it did such a great job clearing off that court, getting all that reflection off.
Well, the glare.
Giving me really rich color and shadows coming at me, and was able to produce, these really dynamic compositions that I had never done before. And so it's things like that. Find a rule to break. If you find yourself saying, no, I shouldn't, I'm not supposed to do that, then just go do it and find a way to make it work.
Can you offer any thoughts on where someone just getting started in tennis photography or trying to up their game can find outlets for their images?
If you just want to, get into it, I would say the smaller publications are really good. The town publications, any place, if there's a college that has a tennis team, it doesn't have to be professional tennis. There's very good tennis that's easier to access. The smaller tournaments, but one of the great things about tennis is you can shoot it. You can, as a ticket holder, you can get next to the court and shoot. So just go practice. Practice and get your photos out there like you would with any
Would
other
there be
kind of
restrictions
photo.
for somebody coming in with a professional camera and a long lens if you're not accredited?
There could be, depending on the tournament. The U.S. Open doesn't. They don't want people bringing in a monopod. But there aren't particular restrictions against still photography. Sometimes you might have a security guard who doesn't want you to bring something in because of some reason. There might be something going on. I remember a few years back when Michelle Obama visited, and they have the latitude to change security restrictions depending on something you might not know about. Right. But generally speaking, the there really aren't a lot of restrictions for what you could bring to the U.S. Open.
Cool.
In terms of camera gear.
Let's throw that part in there.
No backpack, though. That's the thing they say, no backpack.
Yeah.
So if you want to bring your camera, bring it in a shoulder bag.
Really quick to mention, because I went out to the U.S. Open a few years ago with a friend from Argentina, and if you're looking for outlets and you're trying to find kind of an avenue to get in, okay, follow the Argentine tennis players that day, and then try to shuffle your work toward their local newspapers.
That's smart, and I think it might be easier with the lesser known players. If you go to the U.S. Open and get a photo of Roger Federer, you're competing against 5 billion other Roger Federer photos. But if you're there and there's some college kid who happened to win a first round match and it's a huge surprise, and you got some photos of him, there might not have been another photographer there. So even you might have the only photo that town paper wants, or that college alumni magazine wants. You might be the only one who has it.
All right, Chris, it's been terrific talking with you today. Also, you also do national parks at night,
right?
And you do tennis photography. Any consideration of possibly doing a workshop sometime? National tennis stars at night, like time exposures of famous people in the middle of a court. Just think about it. Anyway, all joking aside, if our listeners would like to see more of your work and find out what you're up to and workshops and all of that sort of thing, where should they go?
My website, photographingtennis.com. So that's sort of the central basis for my book. I have a book, first book I ever wrote, is Photographing Tennis. And on there is linked to all my social media, including Instagram, where I'll be posting to Instagram several times a day during the U.S. Open. Some action photos, but also some kind of behind-the-scenes stuff. So you can kind of see what it's like to be in the photo pit.
At Shooting Tennis on Instagram.
Shooting Tennis on Instagram.
And Photographing Tennis on the www.
My marketing friends are going to smack me for that, aren't they?
Totally. We'll find you, though. Chris Nicholson.
Yeah. Anyway, Chris, thank you so much for joining us once again.
Thank you for having me.
Okay.
We hope you're enjoying this edition of the B&H Photography Podcast. Send us a tweet at BHPhotoVideo, hashtag BHPhotoPodcast.
Okay, we are back, but we're not only back, we are at the U.S. Tennis Association Billie Jean King National Tennis Center in Flushing Meadow, Queens. It's opening week at the U.S. Open Grand Slam Tournament, and we are speaking with Jennifer Pottheiser and Reed Kelly of Drawbridge Digital. It's nice meeting you guys.
Thanks for having us.
Now, Jennifer, you're a photographer, right?
I am.
Now, Reed, you're not a photographer. You are?
I'm not. I used to be in the military, and I'm one of the founding partners at Drawbridge Digital and do a lot of work on the software engineering and operations side.
Okay. You guys are in charge of X amount of photographers and editors.
We are in charge of all of the photography for USOpen.org. So that's about 20 photographers and editors for the 3 weeks of the tournament.
Okay, now you are taking pictures, you're photographing, you're processing the images, you're archiving them, you're doing the whole thing. Where do they go from there? Where are these pictures going to?
Yeah, so that's a great question. They go from the photographers to our editing team. The editing team adds all of the appropriate metadata. They upload them to the U.S.T.A.'s asset management system, which is powered by Drawbridge Digital. And from there, the content is available to all of the U.S.T.A. staff. So for the immediate, they usually wind up on usopen.org, on the website, on the app, in social media. The public relations team might be pushing content out for work that they're doing. The marketing team might be pushing images out for what they need.
I was curious to know, you have a lot of needs. I mean, how many of these needs are spelled out in advance?
I would say probably about 60% is assigned, 40% is sort of expectation of what our client needs. We'll meet in the morning with the editorial team and we'll find out stories that they're going to do, and we'll assign photographers accordingly. We have other photographers on site who aren't necessarily so action focused. This is the 50th anniversary of the U.S. Open, so it may be more about the space and about the events that are going on, because all of the content that gets created this year is really new content in that there's new branding, there's new signage, there's new spaces. Louis Armstrong Stadium was unveiled today, and the transformation of the grounds is finally complete. So this year has a different energy about it in the needs for photos and the excitement around the event.
Who are some of the other clients you guys work with?
We're also very lucky to work with people like Brooklyn Sports and Entertainment, that's Barclays Center, Nassau Coliseum, the Brooklyn Nets. They are another sports world client we work with to have this nice company-wide standardized media operation is a money save, a time save. It's just a good thing to have for these big companies. During a big event like the U.S. Open, we are uploading constantly. Like right now as we sit here, our team is, pumping pictures into the system. Anything that is uploaded into that asset management system is then instantly accessible by anyone across U.S.T.A. Okay. So during this kind of event where all hands at U.S.T.A. are here, whether it's sponsorship or PR or whatever it is a nice tool for them, because they see it, sponsorship might see a nice picture and say, wow, we can take care of IBM or Mercedes. They can just grab from that system and do what they need to do.
And can you speak about the programs and the software that you use for the various functions?
Yeah, so sort of starting all the way at the photography end, our photographers are shooting, the best gear from your favorite manufacturers, and it then, whether they are dropping cards off or using an Ethernet tether, that content is then processed by photo editors. We have standardized on using Photo Mechanic and Adobe Photoshop. We have a pretty consistent naming and metadata system that the editors all follow, and it is, at the end of the day, 99% an editorial operation, so we're not doing a lot of photo manipulation or digital art beyond just general cropping and toning of images. But the sort of core programs are Photo Mechanic, Photoshop, and the Drawbridge Digital asset management system, and then the IBM publishing platform that underpins all of U.S.T.A.'s public-facing outlets. It's a lot of logins to remember.
How many passwords you got?
We're big proponents of password managers like LastPass, so we try not to have to human remember any of them.
Now, do you work with any of the stock agencies? I would imagine there must be some kind of a relationship you have.
Not really.
Okay, well, I'm wrong occasionally.
It is actually a little bit competitive because depending on who you ask, having an in-house photo service where you own all the rights to the content is advantageous. And I will sort of leave it at that. For the obvious reasons.
So photographers that work for you, you own all of the copyright.
U.S.T.A. does.
U.S.T.A. does, okay. Now what about the photographers themselves? Are they allowed to do sales of these images on their own, or they're just salaried?
All of our crew is on project assignments, so the U.S.T.A. likes to protect their brand, so they own copyright to everything. The photographers are able to use stuff for their promotional purposes, but they cannot make additional money. Okay. Our photographers are all seasoned veterans and appreciate that the U.S.T.A. wants to protect their image.
Yeah, no, they get it. They understand.
I actually wanted to get back a little bit to the editorial aspect of it, and I'm sure you have some photographers that are the action guys and girls, and others that may be better at documenting the scene. And is it your job then to kind of assign them to each day? All right, so and so, I know you're great. You're going to get some great stuff from the side courts. You go do that, and you juggle it. And how do you handle that?
Yeah, so a lot of the work is done months in advance in terms of scheduling and in terms of thinking about the best way to manage these 3 weeks, because you get here on the day before qualies and the U.S. Open is here and you just get swamped with it and you don't look up for 3 weeks. So we really try to have schedule figured out and photographers assigned and the best people in the best places in advance. We really try and keep things appropriately balanced, that you're here for some day shifts, which are really challenging to shoot, not because of the tennis, but because the light.
The light must be horrendous.
We want to make sure that those photographers also have the luxury of shooting some of the marquee matches at night. That rotation, I think, really keeps everyone fresh and on their toes, both photographically and emotionally.
Well, how important is it to get everybody, all the players? The U.S. Open is kind of known for finding an early favorite and, especially an underdog and having them run through the tournament. So you want to be able to get their first match, their first round. You want to kind of help build these stories too,
Absolutely.
Right?
Yeah, that is a common thing that we talk about in the mornings, like how can we stay ahead of these stories that are unfolding.
Yes, you guys, do you have any relationship with gear companies? Do your photographers shoot whatever they bring?
So both Canon Professional Services, Nikon Professional Services, and now also Sony Professional Services, they have a big presence at the tournament and will reach out to our shooters, a month or so in advance and say, hey, what is your wish list on gear and what can we make sure that we have for you? And then we'll connect with those company reps and get gear, and we'll have that available in our office for photographers to try out or just get more comfortable with, or just not put the onus on their own gear. So it's a good opportunity all around for both the manufacturers and for our shooters.
Let's say there's a moment that you guys didn't catch. Do you then reach out to one of the other agencies / competitors maybe?
U.S.T.A. does have a subscription with Getty Images, and that is their fallback.
Do you guys get nice portraits of the players?
Jen does beautiful championship portraits of the men's, women's, and doubles champions.
Early on, when we started this, it seemed like a natural ask to see if we could do championship portraits, and the U.S.T.A., as in a lot of the things that we proposed, they were receptive and said, yeah, sure, that seems like a good idea. So 4 years ago or so, we started doing championship portraits on championship weekend, and that has turned out to be a really nice thing as a photographer and a really nice thing for the U.S.T.A. to have that in their historical archive. So now player agents kind of expect that is just another stop along the media tour. So that has been really great. And I think there have been a lot of things that we've wanted to try and again are really fortunate enough to be able to do. I think last year might have been the first year that we did it, but we asked 2 of our photographers to come and take pictures for the day with their own creative direction. They weren't assigned to a specific match. It was just go play. And the 2 photographers that we asked to do it said that in their 20 plus years of shooting, they had never been on an assignment where they were able to just go take pictures. And they said that it was so much fun and so exciting. And we got amazing, amazing pictures as a result of it.
How about drones? Have they come into the conversation yet?
We have talked about it in the past. There are some technical considerations with LaGuardia Airport right nearby and not being able to fly the drones.
Also, there's some great vantage points here so that even though you might not be able to get drone photography, you might be able to go up to the highest level in Arthur Ashe Stadium and shoot down on a court.
You have 20 photographers shooting here for 3 weeks. How many pictures are you actually taking, harvesting? Now, and also, out of that, how many actually make it out there?
Our editor team is 6 or 7 people. They work as hard, if not harder, than the hardworking photographers. But in terms of volume, I don't know the exact number, but it is many terabytes of total content generated. I think last year was almost 4 terabytes.
What do you guys use for hard drives?
So for the hard drive brand, I am partial to HGST, which is now owned by Western Digital, and we really like these helium-filled hard drives. But this U.S. Open, actually, U.S.T.A.'s asset management system, the archive, and the daily working server that people are working off of is all SSD based.
And do the photographers just drop the cards and that's it, or do they?
Yeah, so the photographers, if they're shooting on some of the outer courts, they will just drop cards off, or if we have an editor that maybe is in between doing things, they could run out and run cards for them. But on the newer courts, and definitely the big courts, Louis Armstrong and Arthur Ashe, there is Ethernet connectivity. So the photographers will just plug in and tether, live back to the editors, and that's just fantastic. If the photographers weren't as good as they are, and we had a lot of junk to parse through, we maybe wouldn't do that. But the photographers are very good, and the editors are all very experienced with those kind of truly live workflows to be able to manage that inflow of content.
How many hours a day are you here in these 3 weeks?
20.
You guys turn off the lights and lock the door. Okay.
We do.
It, as often happens in photography, first to come, last to go, but really so blessed to be able to call this home for 3 weeks, and really fortunate to be able to work with such a great team.
Okay, that's great. Jennifer Pottheiser and Reed Kelly of Drawbridge Digital. Now, is there a website if folks want to see what you guys are up to and take a look at your work?
Definitely, yeah. You can, get in touch with us at www.drawbridgedigital.com, or follow us on Instagram at drawbridgedig, just drawbridge DIG, and you can see some of Jen's work.
I am at pottheiser.com. And we'll have lots of amazing content for the next 3 weeks at usopen.org.
And their social channels at U.S.T.A., at U.S. Open. You'll see our work, that's where you'll see a lot of the work that is generated here. So definitely follow, subscribe to all of U.S. Open and U.S.T.A. stuff.
Cool. Okay. For now, on behalf of John, Jason, and myself, thank you for joining us at the U.S. Open at Flushing Meadow, Queens.